Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Women in Public Policy Program Research Seminar, which this semester focuses on fairness and meritocracy at work. My name is Iris Bonnet. I'm on the faculty here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I co-direct the Women in Public Policy Program. Today, I'm incredibly excited to welcome Professor David Yanagizawa-Drott, who is going to speak to us on misperceptions of gender norms. David is professor at the Department of Economics and the UBS Center for Economics and Society at the University of Zurich, which is my alma mater. And prior to working in Zurich, David actually served as a associate professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School, so was a colleague of mine. David's research focuses generally on development economics and political economy. And obviously, he will talk about gender norms today, but I also want to recommend a recent paper of his that he wrote together with Eliana LaFerrara, a professor here at the Kennedy School, on social norms that I highly recommend to you. It's a review paper helping us better understand how norms might impact behavior. In any case, today he will talk about how we might not always get the norms right. So we're super excited to learn more about that. A bit on the format, David will present for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. You are welcome to ask clarifying questions during David's talk, and in fact, you should put them into the Q&A function. So not the chat, but the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screen. And I'm happy then to bring them to David. And on that note, let me turn it over to David. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Iris, and great to see so many people joining this seminar. Yeah, I'm an economics professor at the University of Zurich. I was at the Kennedy School before, and today I want to talk to you about kind of what I've been working on over the last eight to 9 years in the space of gender norms. And the title sort of gives it away that it's about perceptions of gender norms. And throughout, I'm going to be talking about the distinction between what we can say actual gender norms and what people perceive the gender norms to be. So it's actually a very simple idea that is at the core of this. And then over the last few years, together with various co-authors, we've been trying to measure these two things, the actual versus the perceived, and then look at sort of what are some of the behavioral implications of this? Does it matter for behavior? And then ultimately, are there any policy implications that we can take away from this work? So let me highlight some of the co-authors that I've had on this work. So Leonardo Burstyn, who's at University of Chicago, Alessandro Gonzalez, who's also at University of Chicago, Alexander Cappelen and Bertil Tungolden, they are in Norway, and then Alessandro Vena at Stanford University. So I'm going to be mixing and matching a little bit various work that I've done with these great people. Now, before I start showing you kind of the main theory or the main idea and the data, I actually want you to I want to kind of get your brain going a little bit. So I'm going to actually pose a question to you, and I want you to just do some introspection about how you think about the following policy question. So it's a simple question in many ways, but it requires some thought, right? So I want you to think about whether you agree or disagree with the following statement. So government and companies should give priority to women when hiring for leadership positions. Yeah. Government and companies should give priority to women when hiring for leadership positions. Right? I just want you to do some introspection and sort of thinking about, how the world works and what do you think is good for the world, and then come up to it, whether you mainly agree or mainly disagree with this statement. And to do this, I'm actually going to ask you to pull up your mobile phones if you have some, and use your camera to get to the QR code, because we will also be looking at the answers together. So if you pull up your cell phone and try to scan the QR code, you should be able to come to Menti. And I'm actually going to go to Menti and see if we can all look at this together. 1 second. So let's see here. Why is this not? There it is. Okay, so I see 30 people have joined, 31, 32. Okay, so I'm going to open the poll now here, and so you can respond. And for those of you who haven't logged in, you can see the QR code on the right as well. I'm going to wait a few more seconds. Okay, so this type of question, whether you personally agree on a certain policy position, right? I'm going to call this moving forward a first order belief, right? That is your private opinion on a matter, which can be determined by your personal morals or convictions or worldviews more broadly, right? But just for definitional purpose, I'm going to call this first order beliefs. Now, there's a second dimension I would like to measure, which is I'm going to call second order beliefs. And this is rather than looking inwards about how you feel yourself, you're going to be looking outwards at some kind of peer group, right? And in this particular case, I'm going to ask you about, we can come back to this later. I'm going to ask you to think about the US, United States, just as a whole. Normally kind of when we are, I know people are coming from all over the world here, so potentially. So, but we actually asked this question to people in the United States. So, I want you to think about what fraction do you think agreed to this statement? And I'm going to separate this by the fraction of women, the percent of women versus the percent of men. And so you just take your best guess at what you think and try to answer both questions, please. So just as a friendly reminder, the question was, government and companies should prioritize women when hiring for leadership positions. Okay, we are close to 30 now. Very good. So we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at responses now because it's also entertaining. Oh, this is interesting numbers. There seems to be kind of a bug here. Okay, so 58, you think the average in the US is 58 or 59%? I think this is the way. I think Mentis is having some funky thing here. So about 59%, on average, you think 59% of women agree, and you think on average 28% of men agree, and 44 is the population average as a whole. Okay. So this is the second order belief. This is your perception about other people's first order beliefs. And just to go back a second here, in the room, 63% agreed on this position and 38% disagreed on this position, right? Okay, so, but I'm going to be showing you today data globally. So we actually went to 60 countries and asked both first order beliefs and second order beliefs, okay? And this global heterogeneity, I think, is really interesting to look at, and you'll see lots of data today. But I just want you to think now about a very different kind of environment, which is Ethiopia, right? So we now go to global south, right? A very different type of culture, a very different type of economy. And now think, what do you think people in Ethiopia respond, right? And again, what do women think about this policy position? Should government and firms prioritize women when hiring for leadership positions? What do women respond in Ethiopia, and what do men respond in Ethiopia? Okay, so I'm going to look at the responses now. Interesting. So here, on average, you think 52% of women in Ethiopia agree, and less among men, 38%. Okay, so I'm going to be showing you data from 60 countries, including Ethiopia and the US. So maybe just keep these numbers in mind as we move forward. So you think the average in Ethiopia among women is 52% and 38% among men. And then for the US, the belief was 58% among women and 30% among men. Very good. So, okay, why am I asking you this? So big picture. Let me start with just some facts that I'm sure you're all aware of, right? Gender equality is basically everywhere. Everywhere we go in the country, around the world, it doesn't matter if you go to the US or Ethiopia or anywhere else. If you look at across a broad set of metrics, right, you find gender equality, inequality everywhere, right? But sort of the sources of that inequality is quite different. And partly when you look at, let's say, the laws, right? So, for example, when it comes to Global South, on the legal end, there's still a lot of unequal rights and freedoms, right? And we see very unequal outcomes, right? In the Global North, we don't see fully equal rights, perhaps, but compared to the Global South, it's vastly different, right? Across a broad set of legal issues. But we still see some unequal outcomes across different metrics. And I won't go into this because I presume that the audience, given kind of the seminar, is sort of well aware of these numbers, right? Now, in economics and beyond economics, there's a long literature pointing to that even deeper source of this kind of inequality is actually values and norms. Okay, but I would argue that this literature, until a few years ago, has really, when it comes to measurement, really just focused on what we can call first-order beliefs, which is what the personal attitudes are among people. How do people personally feel on these issues? And we haven't really been measuring the second-order beliefs, the perception, right? So I'm going to argue that this is actually quite important omission in the literature, because if you think about sort of a behavioral model, and I'll talk very briefly about this, but if you think about a behavioral model, actually perceptions could be very, very important, okay? Not just what people, their own morals, okay? So this is the key distinction that I'll be talking about, the actual versus the perceived. Okay. So what's the sort of core assumptions going into this research? Well, number one is what people perceive as socially acceptable in society affects behavior, right? That's not to say that other things don't matter, that, let's say, money doesn't matter, or that your own morals matter, but we're just adding another component, which is that what people perceive as socially acceptable in society affects behavior. And this is not exactly like a new idea. Of course, this is sort of long tied to kind of how social norms operate. There's stigma associated with certain actions and maybe even honor associated with certain actions. And people respond to that, right? The people care about their reputation in communities, in various peer groups. And I'm sure we can all relate to that in our workplace. We want to be respected by colleagues and peers and so on, right? But the key thing here is once you start thinking about what do my colleagues or my neighbors or my relatives or my friends, what do they actually think is socially acceptable? Now I'm forming beliefs about this, right? And these beliefs could be correct or incorrect, right? Potentially very, very incorrect, right? And so that's the second sort of ingredient. Now, if they are incorrect, at a sort of societal level, we might actually be in an unstable equilibrium. And this idea has been around for at least 90 years in the social science literature. One version of this is called preference falsification, which is if people perceive, for example, that they're in a small minority on an issue, where in fact they are in a majority, they might stay quiet and not voice their displeasure about the status quo. But there could be sparks at any given moment in time where sort of truth is revealed and you get big societal shift, including sort of revolutions and political upheavals potentially. Yeah. Second of all, even if you don't want to think about, drastic, movement in social equilibria, there's role for policy potentially, right? Which is if people are misperceived about the social norms, and if a policymaker has correct data or access to correct data, there could be very cheap information where you just distribute here are the actual norms in society, and you can get quite quick behavioral change from that. And sort of one way to visualize this is you can think of an individual who's taken some action. One thing that I've studied is female labor supply around the world, starting with Saudi Arabia. And when a female, for example, thinks about this, she might have her own view about whether this is right or wrong. In Saudi Arabia, it turns out also it's going to be very important to look at the husband, because the husband has a lot of decision-making power. And this is actually something we study. We study both husbands and wives, right? But in both cases, right, they're going to be operating a social environment. So they have people around them that agree with a certain position, with a first order belief, right? And in this particular case, as you can see, the person is in a minority, right? But as you move into a different social situation, you might be a part of a big majority on a particular issue, right? And so in this case, it might be way more socially acceptable to take the action that you personally prefer. Now, I haven't mentioned misperceptions yet. This would be true even without misperceptions, right? But misperceptions add another complication, which is I might perceive that I'm in this small minority, right? And I might not have very good information because I'm not communicating with people, and there isn't, a lot of good statistics available. But maybe this is actually the reality, right? And so when these two things don't align, it's a violation of what's called the common knowledge assumption, that people actually don't fully understand what the norms are in society, what values people hold, right? And this is often referred to in the social science literature as a pluralistic ignorance equilibrium, which is sort of the core idea that we've been working with to investigate over the last few years. And the first key piece of work in this line of research was with Leo Bursin and Alessandro Gonzalez, who's a postdoc in sociology at Chicago. So we went to Saudi Arabia because this actually started from a collaboration at the Kennedy School, when I was at Kennedy School, because the center I was at, where the unit Evidence for Policy Design, Rohini Pandey and Asim Khwaja were collaborating with the Ministry of Labor in Saudi Arabia. And Ministry of Labor in Saudi Arabia, actually, they wanted to talk to economists about how can we actually get women to work outside of the home and sort of actually become sort of earn an income, right? So it sort of came out of that research, so that collaboration. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, and some of you may have seen this work, but I think it's an important sort of fact I want to kind of share before I go to the global study. Okay, so what did we do in this study? Okay, take a look at the picture to the left. So we did a series of studies, but the main one I would say is when we took married men all around age 30, 35, okay, actually quite educated men, and their wives were quite educated. And we brought them in various sessions into a big hotel room like this. They would often come from the same neighborhood, so they would know half of the people in the room, friends, neighbors, etc. And we had them take a survey on their phones, just personally. And we did actually ask them this first order belief question, which was a very, very basic question, which was, in my opinion, women should have the freedom to work outside of the home. Okay. And we saw great support for this position. Depending on how we measure this in the room, or we have also done it nationally in various ways, also to get to really good measurement. We spend a lot of time thinking carefully about measurement and what's called avoiding experimental demand effects and social desirability bias. we always found the same thing. So 82 to 85% of men were in favor. But then when we asked them, what do you think other people in the room thinks, or in other versions where we asked what people in Saudi Arabia thinks, we would always get the same result, which is people vastly underestimate the support among men, okay? Even among men that they know. So, 75% or so underestimate the support. And when we give this information to them in the room about what their peers think, and then we give them a choice about whether to take some money or sign up their wives for a for a service that help them find white collar jobs outside of the home, we see a big effect in the take up of this offer. So giving up money to help their wives find a job, and then we track these wives over the next few months and see if they actually go to apply to jobs and apply for job interviews, etc. And we find effects also there. So, for example, in the control group, the wives of the men who didn't get any information, about 6% have applied for a job in the next 3 months, whereas in the treatment group, that was almost tripled to 16%. And this is very statistically significant, right? So that showed you two things. One, you can have this pluralistic ignorance equilibrium where people have misperceptions. But two, if you give simple information about the truth, you can get a pretty big behavioral response pretty quickly. And in this case, probably in a more efficient direction. Okay. So that leads us then to a more recent study. We did this a few years ago, but the most recent draft was basically end of last year. Okay, how gender is received. So here we thought, okay, but maybe this Saudi Arabia is just some peculiar outlier. It's a very peculiar history in general. Very, very. The laws have been, far from equal, and so on and so forth. Maybe there's a particular culture, right? We thought, why don't we take the same kind of question? We'll go to 60 countries all over the world. And then we decided to also ask the second question that I've asked for you, which is, in Global North, sort of this basic rights issue has sort of been, that issue is over with, right? It's not really a policy topic that's been debated. What's been debated in Global North on gender, I think, is some version of affirmative action, you may call it, which is whether governments and companies should give priority to women hired for leadership positions. Okay, so we also asked that question around 60 countries. Okay, so what are the reasons question here? First, we just want to understand how common are these kind of misperceptions. Is it something rare, or is it something very universal? And then what's the direction of this misperception? Do people tend to underestimate sort of the progressive position, or do they tend to overestimate it, or do we see different things in different countries? What are the patterns of the direction? And then in terms of the mechanisms, and you're going to see there's going to be a lot of misperceptions, right? We also try to say something about why do they arise? Why do we see misperceptions in different countries? Okay. And I'm going to try to touch upon the third thing also today. The paper is actually quite involved and quite technical. There's some econometrics in there, but hopefully I'll show you some data, very simple data that at least gives you a sense of what we think is going on here. So the main contribution, I think, we are the first to measure both first order and second order beliefs, which allows us to measure misperceptions across the globe. Okay, and we can provide evidence of systematic forces that give rise to these kinds of misperceptions. Okay, so I'll show you first the data that we collect. So these are the countries we went to. We collaborated with Gallup. The advantage here is they really emphasize nationally representative sampling. They're probably the best in the world for that. Contrary to, let's say, if you were to run an online survey experiment. We got about 1,000 people in each country, a little bit more in the bigger countries. And this represents 85% of the world population and 90% of global GDP. Okay. And here's a little, if you have some particular country you're interested in, here's the list of them. Okay. One thing out of the 1,000 respondents is a little bit on the methodological side. We actually randomized different versions. So the two different policy issues, we randomized which one they would get. And then we had something where we asked them what they thought when we asked them about second order beliefs. We asked them, what do you think other people truly believe versus what do you think people will tell others like us in a survey? Okay. to sort of get a sense of whether people expect a lot of demand bias. Okay. In the paper, we actually go through various exercises to sort of address what's potentially misreporting that people won't truthfully report. But I think we did a pretty good job in the end, doing what we can to sort of say we're capturing real data. Okay, so let me just get to the main facts then. So number one, basic rights. What do we see? So here, it's really striking. So dark violet here, purple, represents 80% or more think that women should have the right to work outside of the home, right? And so the thing that we saw in Saudi Arabia, we see in, give or take, every country around the world, right? You see a few countries with a little bit lighter and lower numbers, right? But global South, global North, there's strong support for this position overall in the population. Now here, what we're looking at here is the misperceptions, right? So this is comparing what people actually say versus what people perceive on average, right? And here you can see the entire world is actually red. What does that mean? Red means underestimation of this progressive position, okay? So we didn't find a single country in the world where we find overestimation. And actually, a lot of countries are far from having correct beliefs. Okay, so this thing that we detected in Saudi Arabia seems to be way more universal than just some peculiarity from Saudi Arabia. Okay. Now, and here's to sort of see this a little bit more in a graphical form, where y-axis is the actual support. And now I'm going to split. So far I showed you average population values. Now I'm going to show you by gender of the respondent. Okay. So orange here means support among women, and green means support among men. In one version, we had pink for women and blue for men, but we thought, we don't need to, reinforce stereotypes even further. So orange here is women, and green is men. So what do we see? Hopefully you can see it already. So again, more than majority in every country is in favor, but even men, in everywhere men are a majority are in favor, right? But we see essentially in every country, especially where you have meaningful variation here, we see that women are more in favor than men. Okay, this is perhaps unsurprising, but let's just recognize that we see a gap here. Now, here's the misperception. Okay, and 0 here is at the top, right? So you see again, in every country, it's below 0. And these are percentage points on the y-axis. So you see misperceptions of 20, 30, 40 percentage points in these countries. So these are not small numbers. These are very large numbers. Then moreover, look at the the green dots here. These are misperceptions about men. So men are extremely misperceived globally, okay? The vast majority are in favor, but when you ask people perceive that men are actually, often a majority of men are against, okay? So we see this for basic rights. Again, Saudi Arabia wasn't a special case. This seems to be pretty universal phenomenon. And men are the most misperceived. Women are a bit better understood globally. Okay, so here's the second policy question, affirmative action, how people feel about that. Okay? So here we see way more heterogeneity, at least compared to the first question, okay? Maybe the color coding here isn't super helpful, but so I'll show you a little bit more specifically. But you can sort of see a trend here, which is the darker colors tends to actually be in global South, okay? Latin America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, okay? Whereas the lighter colors is more in the global North. And of course, global North has progressed more than global South, but there's some pretty clear patterns, okay? Here are the misperceptions about support for affirmative action. Here, again, we see quite clear patterns if you think of global North versus global South, right? So global North tends to be dominated by blue here, except for France, okay? What does it mean? It means that the perceived support for affirmative action is actually greater than the actual support. And in the global South, take countries like India, take places of Latin America, Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, we see red colors. What does that mean? People underestimate the support for affirmative action. Okay? And so here is sort of the graphical version of this. This is first order beliefs, and here's so you can see it's very heterogeneous across countries. Again, female support is greater than male support, essentially everywhere. And here are the two numbers for the two countries I mentioned before. Okay, so Ethiopia, 81% of men support this, and 91% of women. Okay, that's up here to the right. And I surveyed you, 15 minutes ago, and as I recall, the numbers were more like 55% support among women, and you perceived among men the support to be below 50%. Okay, so again, it seems to be going through here that there's misperceptions about the support in Ethiopia overall, both for men and for women. For USA, you can actually see that women 48% support, whereas men 38% support. Okay, and here I think also in our little survey we did at the beginning of the seminar, the numbers that were perceived in the room on average were actually higher than this, right? So we see the same pattern go through in this room, which is people actually overestimate the support for this position in the US and underestimate the support for this position in Ethiopia. Okay, and this is again very consistent what we have documented by going to country after country, asking different types of people. Okay, so it seems very universal. One thing to notice here, which I think is interesting when it comes to misperceptions that I've sort of highlighted that globally, there are these parts of the world, right? Thailand, you see Tanzania, Colombia, where people underestimate support, and especially among men. Whereas here in the global north, Holland, Poland, I think this is maybe Switzerland, Canada, Austria, the US, okay? Here we see overestimation, and it's primarily women's position that are misperceived. Okay, so here people think the support among women is actually greater than the actual support, and men are actually people kind of on average guess about right among men actually. So we see this globally, both underestimation, overestimation, but there's some very stark patterns or systematic patterns. That it's mostly underestimation among men, except sort of in the countries up here to the right, and then for SCB of women, we see some evidence of overestimation. Okay, now, one way to structure this thinking or this data is to say, okay, but where do we see these patterns? Instead of just looking at maps or country by country. So what we did is we took the UN Gender Equality Index and we just divided the world into tercile, right? So bottom 20 countries, middle 20 countries, top 20 countries, right? And so tercile 3 is the most gender equal countries in the world by economic data, health data, etc. This is a broad index. So here we see a clear pattern. Number one, the more gender equality that has been achieved in the country, so the less is the support actually today. Okay, but everywhere we see that support among women is greater than for men. And then when it comes to misperceptions, which is the graph to the right, in the global north, in the most gender equal countries, it's the women's position that is the misperceived one. Okay, and men are pretty average beliefs are about right. Whereas here in the most gender unequal countries in the world, men are the most misperceived. That's the green bar here. Okay, so about almost 30% percentage point misperceptions in places like in Africa and so on. So you can think of this as the progressive north, and this is sort of the conservative south. So those are some facts, and so we lay out these 6 facts carefully in the paper, and then the final thing we want to understand about why do these. Is there something, there's clearly systematic patterns, but can we say something about the underlying forces driving these misperceptions, right? And here, what we did in the paper, and this is why it gets a little bit technical, is we try to take a look at what has the social sciences broadly said in economics, but also in psychology, social psychology. Those would be, some of the key fields that have been discussing this. And they have different terminology and slightly different takes on this, but we found that there were sort of three common themes that's discussed in the literature, three theories. Okay, the first one is often referred to as false consensus. False consensus means that whatever my own position is, I think that other people hold the same view as me. Okay, I think there's a sort of a broad agreement on my own position. That's number one. Number two is what you can call minority overweighting, which is whatever is the minority position on a policy issue like this or on a values issue, because information flows aren't conducive to finding the truth, perhaps because there's a vocal minority, or perhaps because mass media tends to sort of want to have a balanced view, showing one side of the story or another side of the story in a balanced way. What tends to happen is that whatever is the minority, people think that that minority is bigger than it really is. Okay? So we call this minority overweighting. And then the third potential force that we look into is what's called gender stereotyping, which is when people think about men and when people think about women, they get distorted perception about what men want and what women want, or what men are like, what women are like. That leads to stereotyping. Okay, and there's a very nice formalization of this idea by Bordalo et al. And Schleifer that gives quite sharp predictions that we can take to the data. And so to summarize, we actually find no evidence of, well, we find evidence of false consensus, but it can't really explain these global patterns. Okay. What seems to be driving is the combination of minority overweighting and gender stereotyping. And both forces together give rise to these global patterns. And we try to quantify that, and we find that it explains a whole lot of the variation. But here's a way to visualize this minority overweighting. So each dot here is a country and a policy position, right? So, maybe this is, Ethiopia on affirmative action. Maybe this is Ethiopia on basic rights. Maybe this is US on affirmative action. Maybe this is US on basic rights, etc. Okay. So we have these 60 times 220 data points. And on the x-axis, we show the actual support. And on the y-axis, the average perceived support, right? If people have perfect understanding of norms, all the dots would line up on the 45-degree line, but they don't. And it's very systematic, right? When the minority is in support of a position, you tend to get overestimation. And here, you get underestimation, right? And so that's both consistent with minority overweighting, because over here to the right, when 90% of the population is supporting it, actually only 10% are against it, but people think it's more like 30 or 40% that have this position. Okay. That's minority overweighting. Then stereotyping. Here's one way to show this, which is to say, what is the difference between what women's first order beliefs are minus what the men's are? Okay, this is the actual, and on the y-axis you see the average perceived difference. Okay, so if there was no stereotyping, all these dots would be in the 45-degree line, but almost all dots are above, right? So that means that people perceive that the conflict between men and women are much bigger than it really is. Right? So men and women, yes, there is a difference, what men and women want, but that difference is not as big as people perceive. People perceive a big gap between what men and women want, but the gap is much smaller. Okay, and the stereotype model says that this can actually occur very systematically, and this is what we see kind of in country after country. So just to conclude, we find misperceptions about gendered attitudes pervasive around the world. If the evidence is consistent with what we call minority overweighting and gender stereotyping, There seems to be potentially two unstable equilibria. If if information transmission improves, but the equilibrium is very different in the south versus in the north. This opens up for policy interventions just to sort of spread this information to people that could create behavioral change. I think this is a little bit interesting now because you have to sort of it's partly a normative question. You could on the one hand you say, well, it's always good to reveal the truth, which I think is a valid position to hold. Um, but you might get behavioral change that go in a direction that some people may not think is optimal. Okay, so we don't really take a strong stance on this. I think we're more saying, look, there are potential behavioral responses to people learning about this. I think there's a number of open questions for future research. So why, you can take it even one step further. So why is there minority weighting? We speculate that part of this could be about how media portrays what women stand for and what men stand for. And there's a lot of work on how mass media sort of the incentives for reporting. You can also think that maybe social media has contributed to this. It would have been great to if social sciences had been measuring this over many decades, we would be able to sort of say more about time trends, but we can't really because ours is the first to do this globally. But I think this is a very interesting question. Same thing with both minority weighting and stereotyping. Like, where does this come from? So in psychology, there's almost like neuroscience kind of like this is like deeper rooted, like how the brain works, right? But you can also imagine, we also know from the literature that stereotypes are sort of reinforced through various sort of social mechanisms and so on. So I think that's still an open question. And with that, I'll end. And thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, David. This was super impressive how much you covered and very, very interesting. So there's a first comment, which is really more of a comment than a question, and also not something that I think necessarily you or I have a strong opinion on, because it's more of a legal question whether affirmative action is in fact about preferential treatment or is more about removing barriers. But I think my understanding of your use of affirmative action was just that's a shortcut to talk about the actual question that you used. And the
Yeah,
question that you used is the question that you asked all of us at the beginning. Am I
yeah,
correct in that understanding?
exactly. Yeah. Um, no, I think it's a good point. But what does it mean to prioritize, right, when you're hiring for a position? Like, there's a whole range of approaches there, right? Uh, I'm not a legal scholar, right? So, you could discuss like sort of legality, right? But you can also just think of this on a day-to-day basis. A CEO of a company saying, okay, we need to fill this leadership position. Should we make a priority somehow to find women, right? So I think let's say the somewhat weaker version would be, we're just going to make an extra effort in finding high quality women, right? Perhaps, right? That would be a way weaker. There's no legal issue here, right? And so, but there's a whole range there, right? The tricky thing when you try to measure something globally, you have to ask the same question to same people all around the world. Some of them are illiterate, right? Some of them are, have PhDs, right? Like, yeah, it has to make sense in every country. And we did actually quite a lot of piloting going, having focus groups. We went to Brazil, we went to Turkey, we went to various countries and really try to figure out, like, do people understand roughly what this question is? Like, how do we exactly word it, right? So, yeah, but I don't know if that answers the question, but maybe at least provide some context for how we were thinking about it.
Mm. I mean, I think you highlight, right, how difficult it really is to do comparative work, and how much you have to think about the question and how people interpret the question and they understand the question. One takeaway for me from your research is that it's probably better to be relatively specific rather than ask about, like affirmative action. You probably would never ask a question, what do you think about affirmative action? Because again,
Yeah.
we probably can't agree on what we mean with it. And then around the world, people might not even know
Yeah.
what it means, but also wouldn't agree.
Yeah. And, we didn't even know if we wanted to label the affirmative. We only use this term affirmative in the paper to sort of to sort of categorize this is very different from, let's say, basic rights, right? Or basic freedoms, right? Yeah, but sometimes it's helpful, I think, to have these higher level categories or abstraction, but sometimes it can also just be distracted because at the end of the day, we're asking a question to people, right? And that question, what's interesting when you go global, right? Of course, for example, you saw in India extremely high support for this, right? So among men and women, also very big misperceptions, right? But India is, if you look at various metrics, is a very unequal country, right? And so it's very interesting to see why would 80 to 90%, I don't remember the exact number, but let's say 80% of men say yes to this question, right? Like what? Because one view is like you would say, well, men, if this happens, they might like be the losers of such an approach, right? But they're still in favor, right? So it's sort of, I think that's a super fascinating. We see this in countries. What are these men thinking? Why would they be in favor, right? So one thing they might have is like, look, maybe they think there are a lot of incompetent men in leadership positions, and companies and units would be better run with some minimum. So maybe they think there's actually, an inefficient equilibrium, right? And there's some interesting. I'm just speculating, right? Maybe they are overconfident and that they say, well, with such a policy, I would never get replaced, right? Because I am a high quality, right? But there are other low quality men, right? And they will be the ones kicked out, right? So, Oriana Bandiera has interesting work with Nava Shroff. They work at a multinational company. They don't say which company it is, but the nice thing is it's sort of the same company, same type of task. In many countries in the world, they go and they try to understand productivity of men and women. And they find actually distortions in the most gender unequal countries where actually the marginal price of labor is higher for women than for men, right? And so it's a bit technical paper, but if you take that as face value, it actually suggests at the margin, firms would make higher profit or make more money and be more efficient if at the margin they replace like a man with a woman, right? So it could be that just like a lot of people are realizing this, like at the margin right now, this would be better for everyone, right? That could be consistent with this, right? I don't know, but I think we need much more research to understand this. So
No,
I'm mostly
super
speculating.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Super fascinating. I mean, I
Yeah.
find the Oriana Ashraf paper also very interesting. Just for people to get the quick summary is it's kind of, the idea is that in very unequal societies, only the exception, like the right tail of the distribution, makes it through, right? And that leads to more productivity. And that's why it's so beneficial to have the traditionally discriminated against or underrepresented group kind of being represented. And they focus on gender, but again, that's kind of the idea. And that's, I think, a very interesting. I mean, on India, by the way, David, again, I'm going to speculate and then I'm going to ask you a question. But my speculation in India is different from yours, but it's also totally speculation. Could also be, what we are culturally used to. I mean, India has a long tradition of reserved seats and of quotas on caste, on gender. Was the first country in the world actually to introduce quotas in local government, etc. And you know the papers as well as I do. Just saying. So maybe people are just more comfortable, more used to those type of interventions, and might have made good experiences. And again, we won't be able to know. But I have to. So I have another question, but I quickly have to ask you one question. And that is the time dependence. And you might not have the answer, but I couldn't help but think about the US today as compared to the US in 2020, 21.
Hmm. Yes.
So, and
Yes.
also think about your mechanism, the minority overweighting, and even gender stereotypes, but I'm just going to go over the minority overweighting and who has the loudest voice, etc. Um, you probably haven't done that, and that's why I'm saying you probably don't know the answer, but it'd be super interesting also how this evolves over time as maybe
Yes.
different voices become more dominant.
Exactly. So I think what this research highlights, so first, these perceptions matter for behavior, so it's important to study them. But then if you take that as given, okay, but where did these perceptions come from, right? So I don't know if this is exactly where you're going, but like, with one big difference has been, Trump coming to power and sort of a very different sort of social equilibrium that we seem to be in right now. And so, I think it would be very interesting to go back and see how much perceptions have moved to today. Then there's a question like, have the first order beliefs moved? Have people's convictions moved as well, right? Or is it more about perceptions, or both, perhaps? And then in what direction, right? So my guess would be that probably the first order beliefs are more stable in general. These are convictions that we sort of bring with us from childhood, etc., or formative years, and maybe doesn't move so much. Although at the same time, we have seen people move, example, on gay rights issues quite rapidly, even sort of within the same person. So it's not entirely obvious. It could be a combination. But yeah, I agree with you. I think this is sort of just the beginning chapter. Hopefully, more people get excited about measuring both first and second order beliefs, and we need to do this across time within countries, and also understand better like what's driving all of this. So yeah.
Mm, mm. Super interesting. So I'm going to go to the next question. And the question is more about the practical implications. So, can this be used in organizations who might want to shift behavior? I don't quite see why not, but what is your take?
Yeah, no, so I mentioned we worked with Ministry of Labor, right, in Saudi Arabia. So this was very practical in that regard. And I think we had a little bit of an outside sort of idea because most of the ideas were discussing, okay, we need to subsidize childcare, but like there are no childcare centers, and we need this massive, hundreds of millions of dollars investments in that. And then another issue was, um, well, women really they're not even allowed to drive. So even need to change the law for that, which they later did, but at the time they hadn't. Like, so maybe we need to have a specialized, transportation system for women. How are they going to work outside of the home if they can't even drive, right? And there's no, they can't take public buses on their own. So those were kind of the alternative policy questions that were debated. And then we showed this research, right? And even, MBS was also debriefed on this research, right? And so you can just think of from the highest level of sort of policymaking. If you know that 80% of the population of men, and even higher for women, are actually in favor of, at the margin, progressive policies, it's way easier to act upon that, broadly speaking, for the policymaker, right? And then, of course, the direct effect that we show in the paper is if you just give this information to people, you will find behavioral responses from them, right? And so on that second point, you can imagine organizations taking this, whether it's a small one or a big one, to start thinking, okay, but like for the people that matter, what do they actually believe and what do they perceive? And I would not be surprised that you will find misperceptions. I actually do this so even in my own economics department. When I presented this with the faculty, I asked them what their position was, not just on this, but on a few different questions, even domestic violence. I've done it on various things relating to gender. And it's striking how systematic there are misperceptions, right? It's just we don't talk about these issues actually, very openly, right? There's almost like a stigma, I think, to talk about it, right? And so yeah, I think if people are open-minded to it, there are lots of innovations that can be done in this space. I think if people are a bit creative.
Yeah, I agree. It's super, super important. And I find, the most exciting part in many ways of your research is what you documented in Saudi Arabia, that by telling people, right, what the actual state of the world is, you can
Yes.
shift behavior, actual behavior, which seems really relevant for organizations for any topic, whether you care, sustainability or gender or anything, buy a new
Yeah.
company in wherever and any topic. Anyways, I should go back to questions. We're almost out of time, but we have a question from Poland, which I wanted to make sure we get to. And Claudia asks about Central Europe. So I don't know how much detail you have about the specific countries, but she notes
Yeah.
that Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland have the lowest support, which doesn't shock her. But she is surprised by the degree of the misperceptions.
Yeah. So you see here, Poland's like an outlier. It's the rightmost country here. These are misperceptions about support for affirmative action. People perceive support way stronger than it actually is, right? And for women, people overestimate it by 30 plus percent, right? Whereas the actual support in Poland is down here. Yeah. So very globally, very low support. And actually, men and women roughly agree, quite similar, right? So yeah, for every country, I don't know enough about each country, but you can sort of see what's going on in Poland. Like, I don't know, but someone just studied this, maybe someone that knows Poland a little bit better than me, so. Yeah,
Yes, no, no, thank you. I mean, it is a very good, I mean, good of you to observe that, Claudia. I mean, it is pretty striking. But again, that's the pros and cons of comparative research, that you can't do both. You can't go deep and broad at the same time.
yeah, yeah.
Rodrigo has a similar question to before, but maybe you have actually, and I know I realize we're also out of time, but I think we might have answered that question, is a bit more of what is the impact of disclosure of the actual information, which is what we just discussed, right? That's I think what you demonstrated in Saudi
Yeah,
Arabia,
just to
hopefully.
emphasize it, people care about the social image, right? So they want to take actions that other people approve of, right? But if you misperceive what other people approve of, you might not take an action that you would really like to take, right? So if you provide the truth and you want to take an action, you might be more inclined to take that action, right? So this is what we saw in Saudi Arabia. Actually, men were super happy to have their wives work outside the home, but they were not sort of allowing, quote unquote, this to happen before they find out, oh, actually, my neighbors and friends are completely okay with this. Of course, now the wife can go outside the home and make more money for us, right? So, so that's the sort of the core insight, I think,
Yeah.
or the core idea. Yeah.
And for those of you who want to learn more about this, David alluded to it. He named it, but in passing. It's called pluralistic ignorance. So if you Google it, that's kind of the concept you want to learn more about, on how we are pluralistically ignorant about what's happening around us. And then again, I think your powerful intervention was to compare this with first order and then the second order beliefs. So unfortunately, we're out of time. But as you can tell, this I think was super engaging for our audience. And what a big piece of work. Thank you for doing it. And I think we're all looking forward to many more people doing this kind of work and helping us understand also how these first and second order, maybe more importantly, beliefs change over time. I know you can't hear anyone clap right now, but I'm going to clap. You won't hear that either.
Okay.
Thank you so much for
Okay.
joining us, David. I know it's
All
evening
right.
for you, so we doubly
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for showing up. I appreciate it. Okay. Have a good day and evening wherever you are.